Dan and Amy, well, that wasn't very helpful. That's the Wall Street Journal describing FBI Director Jim Comey's testimony before the House Intel Committee yesterday, saying Comey
was that the headline? Sorry.
Comey doesn't say much is the headline. The Journal op-ed writer suggesting that he didn't disclose much of anything new about Russian meddling in the presidential election or wiretaps at Trump Tower. He was just his usual political self. And Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, was asked about Comey. President still have confidence in Comey? Listen to this vote of confidence.
Sean, does the president still have complete confidence in FBI Director Comey?
There's no reason to believe he doesn't at this time.
Wow.
There's no reason to believe the president doesn't have confidence in Comey. That is not exactly a...
at this time.
Rousing endorsement.
Which means it could change at a different time in day.
But to your point, Amy, that somehow President Trump owes President Trump owes President Obama an apology. Sean Spicer responded to your demand.
So is the president prepared to withdraw that accusation and apologize to the president?
No, we started a hearing. It's still ongoing. And then, as Chairman Nunes mentioned, this is one in a series of hearings that will be happening.
It's just getting started, so hold your powder there, Amy Jacobson, Jonathan Karl.
Okay.
All right. For more on this topic and many others, we're pleased to be joined by His Eminence, the longtime chairman of the American Conservative Union, former NRA president, and the author of the new book, Shall Not Be Infringed, New Assaults on Your Second Amendment. And he's in town tomorrow speaking at speaking to our friends over at the Heartland Institute. He is David Keene. David, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
So what was your read on Comey's performance before the Intel Committee yesterday, and what, if anything, new we learned?
Well, Director Comey has accomplished in the course of the last year something that's almost impossible, and that's to get everyone upset with the way he's performed on both sides of the political aisle and all throughout the political ideological spectrum. Of course, the FBI has both an obligation and a continuing duty to monitor foreign interference in American internal affairs. That's part of the job of the agency. But he didn't really answer any questions, and if you started to parse his words, you found out there was enough wiggle room there to allow people who support the president and people who oppose the president to mine something they could use. So I think that the headline was right. He didn't say much, and he said it in a typically Comey way.
But do you think President Trump should still stand by these unfounded allegations that he was wiretapped from President Obama?
Well, I think the question of whether President Obama wiretapped him is something that's been discounted. That doesn't, and this is where I think Sean Spicer was making the point, that doesn't mean that as this investigation unfolds, as a result of some of the things that were done to associates who were in contact with other people, that people weren't picked up on phones, and that didn't take place in Trump Tower. And remember, public sources have indicated that on two occasions, the Justice Department, the Obama Justice Department, sought a FISA warrant to actually listen in to people there, and in one of them they named Donald Trump. So it's who's listening to who over what and in what way is confused enough that it does merit some investigation. But I would have, if I were there, I would have asked the FBI director the question of, has the FBI ever wiretapped, bugged, or engaged in surveillance on the part of the president against a presidential candidate? And, of course, that happened in 1964, where Lyndon Johnson personally ordered both the CIA and the FBI to bug Barry Goldwater's airplane to plant a spy within his staff. And later on, when J. Edgar Hoover was asked whether this was done, he said, yes, it was. And when he was asked, wasn't it illegal, he said, an FBI director, when asked by a president to do something, doesn't ask whether it's legal. So these things have happened in the past. That doesn't mean they've happened now, but it does mean that we have to be vigilant because power, and particularly the power to engage in surveillance during hot political times is something that's often abused. The leaks tell us that. They may be difficult to uncover, but felonies were committed, and they were no doubt committed by somebody who had an agenda either within the FBI or the Justice Department or someone else who had access to this information. So this is an investigation that does need to go on, and it does need to lead to a conclusion. One hopes it's not going to go on as has been suggested for years, because all that does is fuel the conspiracy theories of those who have yet to accept the fact that there was a decision in the presidential contest last November.
Yeah, I think your point is a salient one. Essentially, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And so this, right? And so speaking of legal aphorisms, transfer to Neil Gorsuch and the Swiss family Gorsuch that was before the Judiciary Committee yesterday. And Gorsuch, and I say this kind of lovingly because I'm a fan, but I mean, he chose treacly storytelling in lieu of wowing the assembled senators with his knowledge of Latin. Is this a lot, Di-Fi and Durbin and the usual suspects giving their usual harangues of anybody who has not read the Marx Engels Reader of late? Beyond that, are we looking, in your estimation, at a fairly quick, unspectacular confirmation of Gorsuch?
I don't think it's going to be unspectacular. I do think it's going to be relatively quick. It's hard to say what the ultimate actions of the Democratic leadership is going to be, because they find themselves in a very difficult position. Neil Gorsuch is a stellar nominee, and there have been indications that they want to look at this in a way that doesn't create the war that will result in the exercise of the so-called nuclear option. There are 10 Democratic senators sitting in the Senate right now who are representing states that Donald Trump carried. And in addition to that, 6 of them are up for re-election. They don't want to get on the wrong side of this if it goes wrong. On the other hand, the ideological left-wing new base of the Democratic Party is demanding that if they don't fight to the final man and woman on this nomination, hell will be to pay. David Brock, who's sort of the leader of the craziest of these folks, wrote in Politico this morning that congressional Democrats there will be no reward for any of them that support Gorsuch. The problem the Democrats have is that the Gorsuch nomination is going to be followed in relatively short order within the next year by another one. Mm-hmm. And when that nomination comes up, then the real balance of the court is going to be up for grabs, because with the nomination and confirmation of Neil Gorsuch, you're going to have the 5-4 court that you had when Antonin Scalia was alive. So it's the restoration of that court. But when the next one, whether it's Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Stephen Breyer or Tony Kennedy, retires, then the president's going to have an opportunity to appoint yet another judge, and that will really make a difference on the court.
Now, some scholars think that Gorsuch is to the right of Scalia, especially with the rights of criminal defendants. Do you agree with that?
No, I think he's very much in the Scalia mold. But no justice can be typecast on every case that comes up before confirmation. I was once in a small gathering years ago with Justice Clarence Thomas, and somebody asked him how he reacted to the in those days the almost constant attacks on him by the Washington Post. And Justice Thomas looked at the person who asked the question, and he said, "For those folks, I have only 2 words: life tenure."
Yes, right, exactly. Look, I want to talk about your book for just a minute, because I make this point all the time that the 2 most successful modern political movements, gay rights movement, gun rights movement. In 30 years ago, not a single state had right to carry. 30 years later, every state has right to carry. And so the nature of your book shall not be infringed. The new assaults on your Second Amendment. I look around, even in Chicago, and I say we're not completely enfranchised with our Second Amendment rights here, but The progress over the last couple of decades has been incredible, from municipal gun bans going away to right to carry being afforded. So, what are those new assaults, the new threats that gun owners face in this country, law-abiding gun owners?
Part of it melds into the discussion about the Supreme Court. 56% of the voters last fall who thought the Supreme Court was important voted for Donald Trump because they were fearful of the rights that might be diminished if a liberal majority emerged on the court. That is nowhere clearer than in the case of Second Amendment rights. But it also goes to the point of what that majority will be, because right now, after the Heller decision, which ratified the founders' view that the individual has a right to bear arms for self-defense purposes, and the McDonald case out of Chicago, which incorporated that right against the states, there are dozens of cases moving up through the federal system that are going to have to be decided as to what are reasonable restrictions that can be placed on that fundamental right. And those decisions are ultimately, or some of them, are going to have to be made by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court remains important. But as John Bolton says in the foreword to our book, this whole attitude of the anti-gun community reminds him of the unilateral disarmament community internationally in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. People who fundamentally believed that if, for example, internationally, if the United States unilaterally disarmed, we'd have world peace and everybody'd sit around singing Kumbaya. In this country, there are a lot of people who don't blame criminals, but blame guns for violence and for criminality. And as a result, they actually believe that if they could snap their fingers and firearms would disappear, there'd be no more burglaries, no more house break-ins, no more robberies, et cetera. That kind of a feeling, that kind of a quasi-religious drive keeps them looking for new ways to restrict those rights. That can be done at the state level, and as I say, those restrictions that will be proposed at the state and local level are ultimately going to have to make their way through the courts, and it's going to take years. Former Mayor Bloomberg of New York and George Soros and others are considering referenda in what they consider to be friendly areas where they can get restrictions that they can't get through the legislature. And as you know, and this is part of the book, the so-called Arms Trade Treaty, which was passed at Mr. Obama's behest and went to his desk right after the 2012 election, was submitted to the Senate a week or so before he left office. It will sit there forever unless the president withdraws the U.S. signature, which is possible, or unless a pro-Second Amendment majority brings it up and puts a stake through his heart. Otherwise, the treaty lives forever, and even if it's not ratified, has effects on U.S. domestic activity, because a nation that signs such a treaty is supposedly obligated, as they say, not to act contrary to the interests of the treaty, whether it's ratified or not. So there are a lot of things out there. And our real point, though, is this, and that is that this is not an attitude that's about to go away. I, on the other hand, sort of going back to what you said, I've always been a glasses half full kind of guy. Back in 1968, 1970, anyone who looked forward without knowing what was actually going to happen would never have suggested that firearms rights would be where they are today. The NRA formed its legislative action plan at the behest of Democratic Congressman John Dingell of Michigan in the early 70s, because he said, unless you do something, unless you get gun owners organized, you can train all the people you want, you can do all the safety talks you want, but they're going to have a right to have a gun.
Yeah.
But today they do. And interesting, I'll just conclude that with a story. I'm a graduate of the University of Wisconsin back a long, long time ago. And I was giving a speech talking about how today young people are pro-Second Amendment, and one of the biggest markets are women. And this young lady in the audience got up and she said, "Mr. Keene, you're so right." She said, "I'm a student in Madison, Wisconsin, and at our sorority, some of the sorority sisters go out every Friday to the range." And I looked at her and I said, "Young lady, when I was a student there, if I'd called up a sorority girl and suggested it was Friday and we ought to go to the gun range, I could have gone through my whole college career without a date.
Yeah,
So
right.
things are better today than they were.
Very good. Yeah, and your point about freedom requiring eternal vigilance is an important one. He's David Keene, former president of the American Conservative Union, of the National Rifle Association, the author of the new book, Shall Not Be Infringed, The New Assaults on Your Second Amendment. And go to heartland.org, the Heartland Institute, where Mr. Keene will be tomorrow if you want to hear him in person, maybe get a book signed. David Keene, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's